So I just want to use this to mention the whole range of different partners and organisations that are involved in this really exciting project. And as an opportunity then to hand over to Catherine Dennison from the Nuffield Foundation. And honestly, we are all as project partners so delighted that the Nuffield Foundation has taken the step of investing in the proof of concept study. And I'm going to hand over to Catherine to say a little bit more about why the Nuffield Foundation wanted to do that.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's fantastic to welcome you to today's event on behalf of the Nuffield Foundation. I mean, it's been great to be involved in working with the team to shape the project, all during a period in which we were increasingly recognising how central digital inclusion is for inclusion in all other areas of our lives. For the Foundation, this project is a very strong fit with our central interests. We support research in 3 core areas: education, justice, and economic and social welfare. Digital inclusion is essential to being able to participate in each of these domains. We know that digital inequalities only interact with and intensify other forms of inequality. Our research during the pandemic showed that children from families living on low incomes were frequently unable to participate in online education, which is likely to only further entrench the socioeconomic attainment gap. Parents involved with family courts struggle to participate in remote hearings that would result in life-changing decisions about their children, illustrating that when we talk about digital inequalities, we are in some cases talking about inequalities in being able to exercise our rights as citizens. We can anticipate that issues relating to the cost of living will only compound difficulties, with families having to make stark choices regarding household spending. Against this backdrop, the current evidence base and policy thinking relating to digital inclusion has appeared fragmented, and it's great that there is renewed focus. Building a minimum digital living standard has the potential to make a strong contribution to introduce a much needed framework for understanding what a family needs to be included in an increasingly digitized world, and the extent to which families are able to achieve this. We really welcome this morning's discussion with you all about the potential of the tool. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Catherine. So thank you so much for that introduction. And just a reminder, if you're not speaking, and can you just check that you have muted yourself just to limit background noise? Thank you. One of the things that we hadn't expected when we embarked on this journey was that there would be a great example of leadership in terms of wanting to pick up the concept of a minimum digital living standard, a concept that had been developed also together with Carnegie UK Trust, as well as Good Things Foundation and colleagues from Liverpool and City and Loughborough universities. And so it is really so exciting that we have Lisa Thomas joining us next from the Welsh Government to explain why the Welsh Government has also seen the value of the minimum digital living standard concept and is funding the project team to do some additional work as part of developing such a standard for Wales. So Lisa Thomas, over to you, please.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, good morning, everybody. As Emma said, my name is Lisa Thomas and I work on the Digital Inclusion Unit in Welsh Government. As you may be aware, we have recently commissioned research to scope and define a minimum digital living standard for Wales. After a competitive procurement process, the contract to carry out this work was awarded to the University of Liverpool, led by Professor Simeon Yates, and will run parallel to the UK minimum digital living standard for households with children that the University of Liverpool are also undertaken in conjunction with the Nuffield Foundation. So why do we want a minimum digital living standard in Wales? As you know, digital is central to everything we do, in our work, in our social life, and to access increasingly essential public services. Digital transformation is increasing at pace. Therefore, it is important that we apply the principles of social justice to ensure that no one is left behind. That is why now is the right time to establish an agreed standard to understand what it truly means to be considered digitally included in modern Wales. I'd firstly like to provide some background context as to why we decided to commission this work. Emma touched on the Carnegie Trust report there, which was published in 2020, and that called for a new minimum digital living standard to be established to create a deeper, more comprehensive, universally recognised baseline for what it means to be digitally included in the UK. Following this report, colleagues on my team in Welsh Government, we started to explore the concept, and we included it as a specific action for policy delivery within the Digital Strategy for Wales, which was published in March 2021, and that is now a programme for government commitment. Subsequently, on the 18th of March 2021, the Digital Inclusion Alliance Wales also published a report titled From Inclusion to Resilience, an Agenda for Digital Inclusion. This report also recognises there is an opportunity for a cross-sector approach to lead the world in establishing a minimum digital living standard for Wales. During spring and summer 2021, myself and my team, my colleagues in Welsh Government, began work to draft a contract specification. The intention being for the standard to be used as part of an evidence base to allow Welsh Government and wider sectors to assess the needs and develop suitable interventions to ensure all people across Wales are able to engage with digital and are also digitally confident and resilient. At the end of autumn 2021, the specification was finalised and went out via an open procurement process, seeking bids to scope the minimum digital living standard for Wales. The contract subsequently awarded, as I said, the University of Liverpool in February this year, with an initial phase of 9 months, and the final report due to be submitted in October later this year. So this report will be published on gov.wales, and there's an option also for a secondary phase of work to consider how such a standard can be implemented in Wales in more practical terms. The current digital inclusion picture in Wales shows that 7% of Welsh citizens aged 16 and over do not personally use the internet. In addition, 23% of those who do use the internet do not have all 5 basic digital skills. This is the latest data from the National Survey for Wales. The pandemic highlighted the significant role that digital plays in society, from engaging with health services to maintaining contact with family and friends. There has never been a greater need for digital confidence, motivation, skills and access. So with regard to next steps, once we receive the final report, it's important that we use the standard as a baseline and consider how this will be measured. Our primary data source will be the National Survey for Wales. So myself and my colleagues on the team have already met with colleagues in our knowledge and analytical services who are responsible for the National Survey for Wales. We've started to have the conversation about how we developed a more detailed set of questions for the National Survey for Wales that align to the agreed definition for the minimum digital living standard. Another important measure is the new National Indicator on the Status of Digital Inclusion. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is about improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, both now and in the future. The Act sets out a number of well-being goals, and the new National Indicator on the Status of Digital Inclusion will contribute to achieving these goals, notably a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales and a more equal Wales. We will consider the outcomes of a minimum digital living standard research, and we will work across government to develop more suitable interventions which address barriers such as digital skills, access and confidence in order to reduce the current levels of digital exclusion. It's important to recognise that the overall response cannot be achieved unilaterally. It does require a multi-agency approach from governments and key stakeholders within the digital agenda. As Welsh Government, we have committed to ensure the minimum digital living standard research findings will be published on gov.wales, ensuring that other governments can look at this research and ideally develop a consistent model for measuring digital inclusion. We have already, through the British and Irish Council, raised awareness of the minimum digital living standard and the aim for having a consistent definition across all devolved nations. So that's it from me today. Many thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of today's session.
Brilliant, Lisa. Thank you so much. And I think hopefully other people in the room will understand quite why I was so excited about the leadership that the Welsh Government is showing here, and also that ambition and aspiration for there to be a consistent measure across the devolved administrations. And it's great to know that there are people in this room as well who are thinking about this at a regional level, combined authority, local authority level, but also critically, to your point, Lisa, this is really deeply directly relevant to all aspects of government policy, and linking it in with the Future of Wellbeing's the Future Wellbeing of Generations Act really speaks to that across all of the different areas of society, economy, and people's lives. But also, this isn't only for government. This is something that we're hoping people across different sectors will engage with as well. So thank you so much. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Professor Simeon Yates, who is the lead for the project team on this, and is going to say a bit more about why we think a minimum digital living standard is so important and why now. Over to you, Sim, and slides up from you, Tom.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Lisa, for the really helpful introductions. Academically, I'm very excited by this project. It's been something that we've developed as a team, during COVID and lockdowns. And I'm going to say this again. This happened because Emma thought about bringing the right people together and the right question together. To think about this issue, bringing prior experience with the minimum income standards work of our Nuffield colleagues together with the digital inclusion work to kind of spark the idea for this. So I think after that was the conversation that started this journey quite a few years back. So why do we need one? So can we move on to next slide again, please? And again. So why do we need one? I've been working on digital inclusion issues in one form or another for nearly 2 decades, which I find a little bit scary to say, and on digital society kind of issues since the 1990s. And we've just got lots and lots of ideas, terminologies, concepts out there. We talk about digital divides. We used to talk about information communication technology divides. You go back a bit further and we would talk about information divides. These days, we tend to talk more about things like digital inequality. When we're talking about skills, we talk about digital literacy. When we're talking about the kind of positives of engaging people with the digital world, we talk about digital inclusion and digital engagement. And these are all great concepts for kind of getting into the topic, but in the end, they lead to a very long list of what to measure. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we end up measuring all sorts of different things. We end up measuring, do you have physical access? Do you not? Is there broadband to your house? Is there not? Do you have a laptop? Do you not? Or levels of access, how often do you use it? What data have you got? What broadband speeds have you got? Then differences in skills, then differences in what you do online and so on. What types of use you make, what benefits you might gain, what hazards you might be exposed to. And again, we can do lots of interesting analyses of all of these. But it kind of leaves us with quite a mix of things to go and talk to government about, or for government to talk, to other agencies about. On some of the very stark binary measures, sometimes things look great. We say 90-odd% of people have got broadband, or 80-odd% of people have got X number of digital skills. But often that just takes a very narrow snapshot of things and doesn't look at the bigger picture. So we go to the next slide, please. And even this is our own prior research work we've done with the Good Things Foundation, things we published academically. You can do the fancy statistics on it. You can identify across lots of those different measures, different groups. And this has been part of the work that we've done at Liverpool and prior to that on these issues to try and help colleagues like the Good Things Foundation and others understand the complexities, understand that, access is not enough, skills is not enough. There are different types of users out there, but it still remains quite individualistic. It focuses on individuals, it focuses on individual skills, and it doesn't look at the broader context. So next slide, please. So, one of the things that if people have heard me speak before will have seen these pictures, but they kind of remind me of the point of all of this. you know, I've done other types of digital research. We did digital performance art in the streets of Sheffield with people covered in £10,000 worth of equipment, running around doing a mixed real, you know, material reality online game arts performance, running past homeless people. And we know from research that one of the things that some homeless people hold on to over and above all else, including food, is their mobile phone to have access to jobs, opportunities to connect with people. You know, the I, Daniel Blake film has those couple of scenes where, you know, the struggle to get your benefits by logging on when you don't have digital skills, etc. All of this kind of stuff talks to very different lived experiences, from people like me with a house full of technology to people with none, to people who are trying to use this technology, as Catherine made really clear, you know, to exercise their basic rights to justice, whether it's the family courts, or we have another project at the moment looking at survivors of modern slavery. You know, people making decisions between food, heating, and also connectivity, and so on. So there is a lived experience, and it's not an individual one. It's one where people do that in households with their communities, and we know that that's really important. Therefore, next slide, please. We need a different approach. And so that's what we're trying to do with the minimum digital living standard. We're looking at households, not individuals. We're not just looking at a list of things like broadband speeds. We are looking at a much broader set of issues. And it's not a top-down assessment. It's not us as experts or people measuring specific things for government saying that's what a minimum standard is, but rather, as colleagues from Loughborough will explain much better than me and in more detail shortly, it's a participatory process by which households and members of the public themselves develop the measure. They develop what counts as a minimum digital living standard and what they would need to meet that as different types of households. So next slide, please. So before we pass over to my Loughborough colleagues, that's the goal, is to end up with a measure that's not just about individuals, and it's not just about binary, you've got broadband, you don't have broadband, but rather, like the Loughborough colleagues minimum income standard, it's saying, as a household, what are the things we need to meet that minimum such that we can operate as a household in contemporary Britain? And by minimum, we don't mean, if we put it in a food context, enough food not to starve, but a minimum to operate reasonably, to be able to do education, to be able to access healthcare, to be able to gain enough entertainment or enough cultural engagement to be civically and socially engaged. And it is a minimum agreed by the public, by citizens, rather than one designed from the outside and kind of imposed on them. So that's our goal with this project, and hopefully our colleagues from Loughborough, Abby, Matt, Catherine, Chloe and people will be providing you a walk through how we're approaching that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Simeon. And actually, you've done a perfect introduction. And so I'm going to hand straight over to Catherine and Abby from the Loughborough University team.
Thanks, Emma. If I could have the next slide, please, Tom. So just as Simeon said, this research methodology, the part that Loughborough are leading, is based on our minimum income standard work, which is work we've been doing since 2006 in the UK. And that started as the answer to a very simple question, which is how much is enough? At the time when we were devising that research, there was a lot of focus on pensioner poverty in particular, and also child poverty. And there were a lot of advocacy groups and people saying that state pension wasn't enough, state support wasn't enough, but we didn't really know what enough was. So we felt that people weren't able to have very well-informed conversations. So we embarked on research to try and find out from members of the public themselves what they thought enough actually was. So what you can see here is our first ever report in 2008, our most recent one, 2021. And because we've been doing it for so long, we're able to do in 2018 a 10-year retrospective looking at how things have changed over time. One of the key things about the minimum income standard is that we do new primary research every 2 years so that we make sure it's a standard based in the society we recognise today and not something that goes gradually more and more out of date as time passes. Next slide, please, Tom. So the minimum income standard process is all about bringing groups of people from the same demographic type together to talk about the needs of an individual or a household of that type. So we talk to pensioners about pensioners' needs, and parents about parents and children's needs, working age people without children about what somebody in that demographic group would need. We start with orientation groups, which is where we find out what people think that kind of standard should encompass. We then take that and are able to form it into a definition, which we then use in the task groups where people identify detailed lists of goods and services. Those are then taken to a further set of groups who revisit the lists and revise them if they feel there's something missing or there's too much of something or not enough. And then we take that to final groups. There is some expert input along the way, but it's always taken to groups to validate rather than just being imposed on them. So that's a very brief, in a nutshell, discussion. And one of the things that's key about this is that we bring together people from across society. We're not just looking at people on low incomes to define how life on a low income would look. It's actually what everyone from our society thinks should be the minimum standard, acceptable standard, even if they themselves are either well below or near or above it. So yes, if I can have the next slide, please. So the MIS definition that we were able to come up with and we've used ever since is that a minimum standard of living in the UK today includes, but is more than just food, clothes and shelter. It's about having what you need in order to have the opportunities and choices necessary to participate in society. So people very clear, it's not just survival, it's about being able to take part in the world around you and not feel excluded. But it's also about what you need in order to meet and how you meet that need as a minimum. It's not a wish list. If I could have the next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. So what we want to do is adapt the MIS methodology to focus in on the digital aspect. We cover that in our MIS groups because we cover everything from socks to teaspoons to bath towels to broadband. But this was to really go into that digital aspect of people's lives in more detail. It builds on established public consensus about what kind of technology people need in their everyday lives, but again, in that, as I say, that more detailed way, with that digital focus. If I could have the next one, please, Tom. Thank you. So the MDLS process is very similar, minimum digital living standard process, very similar. The orientation groups we've used to help us kind of distill what members of the public think is important to be included in this living standard. We then take that definition to task groups to find out from them what they think is important. That input then gets taken to check back groups and then on to final groups. And in this work, because we're doing households with children and technology is something that we know young people engage with can be from a very early age, but certainly through their school career, we're actually doing some groups with young people, and huge thanks to Nominet for their support in being able to do this as well, to feed into the process. I just want to say before I hand over to my colleague Catherine that we did orientation groups. Actually, we can do this on the next slide, please, Tom. Thanks. With not just with households with children, because what we need is a definition that works for the whole of society. Our hope, our plan is to extend this work. At the moment, we're focusing on households with children, but we would like to be able to roll it out to pensioner households, to people without children. And in order to do that meaningfully, you need a definition like the MIS one that is for everyone in society, not just for one group. If we'd only done it with parents, we would have a definition that we knew was appropriate for parents, but we wouldn't have known whether that was okay for pensioners or other people. So that's why in our orientation phase, we included not just parents, but working age adults without dependent children, group of pensioners, group of parents with a range of ages of children between them. and then a mixed group to make sure that what we'd come up with did work across those different demographics. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Catherine Hill. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, hello, thanks, Abby. So I'm just going to, thank you, Tom. I'm just going to talk through a bit about what we've been doing in the orientation phase. I mean, as Abby said, that the work is still a sort of work in progress. We did the orientation phase, those 4 groups that Abby mentioned in February, March, so a few months ago, and we're in the process now of doing the task group and the check back groups. But the orientation phase was the phase where we sort of gathered opinions, discussion, to get a sort of sense of what people's views were on the issue, and that's what led into creating the definition. So we talked to people about what it meant to be sort of living in a digital world, whatever that might mean to people, the implications of being digitally included or excluded, and sort of a bit about the benefits and drawbacks around living in a digital world. And it created a really rich discussion in all 4 of the groups that we did. So there's some overarching themes that are worth mentioning. First was needing to participate in a digital world was seen as inevitable. There was a feeling it was almost unavoidable. Like it or not, people felt there was just no going back from this. And the other aspect of that is that the prevalence of digital use across all aspects of life sort of highlighted the importance of digital inclusion in everyday life for people. So whether that was in sort of work, leisure, shopping, a lot of talk about banking and being able to access GPs and prescriptions, to sort of Google Maps and parking. So I'm just going to sort of throw in a few quotes, but I mean, somebody sort of summed it up really nicely in one of the groups, and he said, everything has technology now. It doesn't matter where you go, what you do, what job. He said, there's always some element of it. And if you don't know how to use it, you can be looked upon differently and not get the same opportunities as other people. So that's why it's important. And another thing that came out strongly was that the COVID had accelerated the need to be online, and it sort of accentuated the difficulties of being left out or left behind. So for example, with children and home learning, one parent said, well, you know, before COVID, they had a laptop, they thought that was enough. But since COVID, they realized that that just wasn't up to scratch. So it sort of changed their perception of what they needed. In the world of work, you know, working from home, access to services, less in-person contact, and keeping in touch with people by Zoom and online gaming and things where you couldn't see your friends. And what people noted, that wasn't just a one-off, it didn't just go back to normal, whatever that might be, and so it's sort of sticking. The other aspect was the aspect of parental exclusion. It can lead to digital exclusion for children as well, so it's sort of how they can miss out socially as well as educationally. So for example, if the child doesn't have a device when they were doing home learning, stigma among peers if they aren't able to join in, but also something that came out, so sort of knock-on impact where parents might not be digitally engaged, so and the impact for children there. So the parent was not on a WhatsApp group for like organising their child's rugby, and they didn't get to know about a rugby match. Another person talked about a Facebook group, the school had contacted them via Facebook to arrange school photographs, and a child was left out because they didn't know about it. The other recurring issue was pace of change, was something that really came out very strongly. People being forced to go online. That term was used in several groups, being forced to go online, that everything had moved online, didn't feel consulted or had consent to go online. And though it did come out strongly, particularly among some people who were less digitally engaged, that they really did want a choice, and important to retain that human in-person element. but fear this is being lost and sort of taken away from them, with the result that they're excluded from things. And I think that is just useful to bear in mind alongside what we are doing here. It can be overwhelming. People talked about it being hard to keep up, it's going too fast, so they felt like they were drowning. And the other thing associated with sort of keeping up to date, the sort of technical obsolescence, which involves cost of replacing devices, but also having to update your knowledge as well. So it was an ongoing process. And across the groups as well, there's a real diversity of experience and attitudes, but it's definitely not, I think, as Simeon mentioned, it's a sort of binary split of you're included, you're excluded. It's groups, some people with more limited digital use, they were quite hesitant about it, resistant, but at the same time said, oh, well, I love Google Maps, or, you know, a great fan of Amazon, but sort of said that they really weren't into digital technology. So it sort of highlighted the complexity of it. So I'm going to say a bit about the sort of disadvantages and advantages that people talked about. There was sort of two sides of the same coin in some aspects, and I'm sure this is all familiar to you, but it's sort of useful to highlight the nature of these discussions, because this then fed into the definition that I'm going to come on to. So just thinking about the benefits, obviously like fast, easy online shopping, the convenience. Someone talked about a parents' evening, they could be in two places at once. It was all online now, so they had a younger child there, didn't have to drag them off to the school. Easier instant access to information, so from reviews of goods or restaurants. Children being able to look things up for themselves, they felt that was a really sort of positive aspect. Extending choice, a wider range of goods, which linked to saving money, shop around more easily online, price comparison sites, and the sort of getting around, as I mentioned already, the Google Maps safety. Peace of mind. Parents also talked about being able to know where their children were by tracking their phone. And the other aspect is about communication and connection, so being able to keep in touch via Zoom and FaceTime with friends, especially important in COVID. And it talked about children having a sort of more personal relationship with a grandparent who didn't live nearby, because they could just Zoom them on their own. And professionally, sort of international meetings, and sort of entertainment, playing games online. And this wasn't just sort of teenagers gaming. The pensioners group talked about, you know, being able to do canasta, and they could do it. One person was a carer for his wife, but he played canasta with people all over the world and said it was great fun. And another person talked about expanded horizons, was something that came out, because you're connecting with people with shared interests. One person who lived in quite a traditional area talked about they'd found an interest in making clothes, and it was cool, and they met up with people and said that, you know, 10 years ago you wouldn't have moved out the valleys or known what was going on, but there's so much more out there, and it pushes you out of your comfort zone, because they'd gone onto Instagram and found that. Accountability, sort of having a traceable trail for email, and the environmental aspect was raised as well, about being paperless. Okay, next slide, please. But on the other side, there were drawbacks. Some of it related to sort of what's out there and what other people might be doing on the internet. So related to sort of security, feeling vulnerable to scams, identity theft, fear of not knowing how to discern what might be okay and what might be okay. And that linked to lack of confidence, pressing the wrong button, not knowing what to believe, misinformation, trolling, people hiding behind anonymity, lack of accountability. And then there's also the sort of risks that they felt could be a risk for the individual or their family or household. So talked about increased consumption, impulse buying, addiction, online gambling. The pressures also with being 24/7, sort of having to access to your work email and your work-life balance, implications of family life, being able to say, people saying things without taking responsibility, And also the impact on health. People talked about less activity if you're in the home using online, but also mental health and the isolation. They talked about the frustration of not being able to, if something went wrong, of not being able to use it. It could be very time consuming. And also, as I said earlier, this sort of loss of contact of human services was a worry. Next slide, please. We particularly noted the concerns for children, and we had groups with parents, but it was also the pensioners talked about this concerns because they got grandchildren, and other people, as a general awareness that for children there are particular issues there. Cyberbullying, some of these were things that they said, well, it was always there, but it's made it a bit different, and it's sort of accentuated things. So like bullying, you just couldn't get away from it now. Knowing who people were talking to online, are people not who they think they are, online grooming, and parents talked about that knowing what the children are accessing, the age appropriateness of something. Someone talked about they didn't know whether something was a fluffy app or a dangerous app, as they called it. In-app purchases, several people, this was mentioned a few times, whether it was an accidental or maybe there was a thinking it maybe wasn't so accidental that their children were using their account to buy things online. And also the other aspect of sharing content, sharing things that will always be out there, and obviously in the background, sort of inappropriate content as well. And the other implications they talked about on mental health as well for children. So it's about being the amount of time on it was something that was raised. You know, people talked about addicted to it. I think COVID was definitely something people said accentuated that. But also to do with sort of mental health, body image, self-esteem, that sort of thing came out. But the thing that was apparent was this, for parents, it was finding this balance. So in terms of setting limits, monitoring the children's use, but balancing that with the children being independent and giving them trust, and also sort of wanting their child to be able to participate with their peers, not feel left out, but being sort of terrified, as they call it, about what they're doing online. So they can have Instagram or Snapchat, but they didn't feel like they had a control over it. And one person talked about it felt like a Pandora's box, that anything can happen. It talked about being a worry and being scary. So some of this was about the worries for the children and how they're using, but it also the parents' understanding of what the children are doing and their knowledge or lack of knowledge about the sort of digital world around them. So next slide, please. And this brought us on to the definition. So these discussions all fed into the definition. So as Abby said, the aim of this was that we're going to be using this going forward. So we developed, as you'll see, it's although it's about digital, we're good old-fashioned flip chart and pens in our groups. And so the definition we've come up with is this. It's a minimum digital. Well, I don't need to read it out because it's there. I will just say that there's been a few tweaks as it's gone along, so you may have seen a slightly different version. It is still a work in progress, but this is where we are at the moment with it. So what I'll do, I'll just go through the different aspects. Just have the next slide. So the different aspects that came out, it was drawing on MIS, so a minimum income standard, which is the principles of it being an acceptable minimum. So it's based on need, but it's more than the bare basics. It's a sort of what's need to, not a nice to have, is something that we use. It's got the key elements of it, or the equipment or devices, having the internet, the connectivity and the support, and they felt that was all integral. You need to have all of those. It's no good having the laptop if you can't connect. Someone gave an example of having a car, but it's useless unless you've got the fuel and you can know how to drive it. And it's about what an individual household needs, but as well as it's linking to the infrastructure as well. But it's more than just having these things. So they talked about the equipment must be adequate, the internet must be accessible, so it allows people to do what they need to do, to have a suitable type or condition of device, sufficient internet speed. In terms of support, again, that has to fit with people's needs. It's not a one size fits all. It's so from wanting just sort of easy access to information that they can look up themselves, to older people particularly discuss wanting in-person support, someone to sit beside them and show them what to do. They often had informal support from grandchildren or children, but people felt that that's not always going to be there. And also the feeling they could feel disempowered was mentioned as well, if say a relative lacked patience. And also the support, it needs to be ongoing because things were changing so fast. So it's about what you can do to communicate, connect, engage with the opportunities, so reflecting the mirrors, being able to participate in the world around you. But also how, and this was quite an important part that came out, the safely, in particular related to a lot of the concerns that people had about the risks. And it's links to the knowledge and understanding aspect of it, how to manage them, knowing what was the risk for them or their children, but also the confidence issues, so being able to do things confidently, links to skills, so knowing what to do if something goes wrong. People talked about the fear of, you know, pressing the wrong link or something, so, and it put people off using it. And we took this definition to the final group, and they felt that this they provided a real world view, and they felt it included what you need and what the outcome was. So we've been using that definition in the ongoing groups we're doing now, where we're deciding on the actual content of what's in the minimum living standard, what families with children need to meet this definition. And so far we've had 7 groups with parents. Participants have been engaged, and they related to the definition. We haven't had anyone that is just not got it. They've really engaged with it. So we've been drawing on the contents of the minimum income standard as a starting point for equipment like the mobile laptop, discussing how that meets needs, but also the skills knowledge for what parents and children need has come out really strongly. That's something we're discussing. We're about to do the first group with young people, with further groups in September, so I'm aware of time. So I think that's sort of brought us up to where we are now. Okay, thank you.
That is brilliant. Catherine, Abby, thank you so much. And also in the room, we've got their colleagues, Matt and Chloe, who have all been working so brilliantly on this. We've got some, so I want to say 2 things. One is we have got, and I'll pick up on some of the questions that are coming through the chat, but also do continue to use the chat to share your reflections and to put any questions in. We've got our last speaker now, and that's going to be Professor Alex Singleton, and he's going to be fast forwarding. So Catherine and Abby have described how the focus groups are going to work and the different iterations of engagement with members of the public. And now we're going to fast forward to 2023 when we'll have that, and Alex is going to kind of share what will happen then. Over to you, Alex. And Tom, if you could put Alex's slides up next, please.
That's great. Do you want to just flick through to the first slide? So I'm Alex Singleton. I'm a professor at the University of Liverpool, and I'm working on this project. So what you've heard today is kind of things that have already happened, but as Emma was saying, this is really a flavour for what will happen next once we've got the insights from the very detailed kind of qualitative work. So I'm a professor of geographic information science, which broadly means that most of my work takes data and produces cartographic representations of those data. So we're interested in patterns of population, patterns of the built environments, and so on, and what those different geographies mean for policy. The way in which we're going to translate this qualitative work into something that we can map for the national extent is through something called Geodemographics. Now, there's lots of different ways in which you can build geodemographic classifications, and And there's lots of different types of geodemographics that are available. But broadly speaking, what a geodemographic classification is a categorical description of the type of people who live within different types of areas and the context in which they live. So, you know, are they high income areas and living in sort of large detached houses? You know, is it an area very dense, urban, sort of populated by sort of professionals and so on? And the way in which these classifications are created is you take lots of different measures about areas, and then we use computer algorithms to look for those areas which are most similar in characteristics. And these, what we refer to as typologies, kind of come out at the end of that process. And what you can see on the screen is an example of a geodemographic. This happens to be one that we built in partnership with the Office for National Statistics, called the Output Area Classification. And this actually was all built on the basis of the last census, and it will be updated with the new census. And what that does is describe all of the areas in which we live in terms of 8 descriptive groups, eight descriptive supergroups broken down into 26 groups and 76 subgroups. And as you go down that detailed hierarchy, there's more description of what those classifications are. Next slide, please. Each one of those clusters is accompanied by a quite rich kind of qualitative description of the type of people and the places in which they live. And this is just an example of one of the subgroups, groups and supergroups. These descriptions exist for all of the different types that you get within a clustering solution. And what is quite interesting about this project is we're starting the opposite way around, in fact. So typically a geodemographic, you start with the data and you find the structure, if you like, of places emerging from the data, and then you do the qualitative work to describe it. Well, actually what we're doing here is we're kind of inverting it, and we kind of know the things that are going to be important to differentiate these geographies, and then we can look at how we can create sort of geographic measures from that, which I think is you know, as someone who's interested in the methods of geodemographics, that's a very interesting point. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide. It's just a short sort of flavour of what we're doing. So the way in which we're going to do this is not completely fixed yet, and we're certainly open to sort of comments and feedback upon that. But the 2 ways in which you can create these kind of geographic measures is something, if you've got a very large survey, sort of multiple tens of thousands, you can use a technique called small area estimation, and you can take your survey and you can estimate these rates at a local area for particular variables of interest, and then you can use those in different ways, but that's not feasible within the scale of this project. So what we're going to actually do is produce a representative sample survey for the UK. We're going to combine that together with geodemographics and use the insight that we get from the geodemographic classifications, and we'll actually use those to measure rates and patterns of interest at a local scale through the combination of those different data. The exact specification of the survey isn't agreed yet, but that will come after we've done the sort of detailed qualitative work that's just been described. You know, as a geographer, I like to put things on maps, and something that we've done in the past, which has been quite successful for a whole variety of different topics, including kind of digital exclusion, is produce what we refer to as a map book. And that can be either sort of 2 things, and again, we're not sure which way we'll go yet. It can be kind of a PDF document of maybe a local authority, and it will give you a whole series of maps of variables of interest, or it could even be an interactive portal. So one of the things that I do here is I run something called the Consumer Data Research Centre. We've got a website, mapmaker.cdrc.ac.uk, and that's an interactive version of a kind of map book. So we can talk to kind of the sort of stakeholder communities about what's most useful after we've actually developed the measures for that. If we're going to be using this geodemographic methodology, so we're likely going to have a series of responses to the survey which will be mapped by these different clusters, so we can create sort of descriptive profiles for these particular attributes of interest. And again, as I said, that's what we'll use to sort of produce these local level estimates of the patterns of interest. And the idea is that then becomes a useful policy tool if you're looking at particular localities, where you can take some of this insight from a national scale sort of deep qualitative survey. And that's all as far as we've got so far in this particular bit.
That is brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. So we're coming to a point now where we've heard all of the speakers, and hopefully, and I do appreciate there is a lot to take on board, but that's also why we've covered some of this in the short briefing paper that we've sent out. So that includes an outline of the different stages and what to expect, and kind of how it's happening. I've confirmed that we will be making the slides available. There was a great question earlier on from Helen at NEA, asking about, you know, whether or not we want this to be public and shared, because obviously we are still in the early stages of this research. And our role at Good Things Foundation as a member of the project team is around supporting the sharing of what is coming through to a wider audience as we go. And that's for lots of reasons, including that this is too important and timely to not be talking about now. And also, if we want this to be as relevant and useful to everyone in this virtual room and people who aren't in here and we would love to be in this virtual room, then that's why we want to make sure that there's no surprises here. We're going on a journey together as we go through this research. And obviously that means there are certain risks, because you know, we might get to a certain point in the focus groups and actually something might come up which really challenges that definition that we've put out there. But we feel it's really, really important to kind of be sharing as we go. And I just want to give real thanks to especially Loughborough colleagues for how brilliantly you've been doing that. It also means that it gives us a chance to spot and understand what are the things that need to be explained more. And so with that in mind, we've had some questions coming in around the use of accessible in the definition, accessible internet. And I'm going to bring Abby in on that, because I think it's a really interesting one. It gives a good example of how much care and attention has gone into thinking about the definition, and why affordability is not the word used.
Thanks, Emma. Really good questions, and thanks very much for everybody's engagement in this. It's quite complicated, but basically, accessible internet, as Kath was saying, it's no good having a car on the driveway if you don't know how to drive it. Also, if it's broken down. So having accessible means having something that's fit for purpose and you know how to use it. But it also means the infrastructure. So it's no good having a laptop if you can't get broadband to your home. It's no good having the ability and the desire to do things, to interact and want to access them, if the speed is insufficient to allow you to do any of that competently, if you can't fill in an online form without it timing you out because the connection keeps crashing or whatever. So there are lots of different aspects. It's quite a nuanced thing. It's not a one size fits all. Affordability was something that originally was in the definition when we did our first draft, but it was particularly pertaining to the internet being affordable, which was kind of people felt a responsibility for the providers, not for people. It's not about what people themselves should be able to afford in terms of making sure their money went far enough to afford it. It was about it being priced at a way that was inclusive rather than excluding people. And we felt that because, as with our minimum income standard work, it's so crucial that people understand this as a conversation about what everyone should be able to have, not what they should, what they can or can't afford. We felt having that word in the definition would be too confusing. So we took that back out, because it's not about what you can afford, it's about what everybody should be able to have. And there's a kind of another layer of conversations there about, well, how does it get provided? So like in minimum income standard, we know what the minimum income is. how that gets provided or how people meet that is a conversation for employers, for government. There are things that could be done about housing costs or childcare costs that would make that the income necessary come down. But that's a very kind of complex conversation that isn't just about everybody needs more money and that's the end. So hopefully that helps to explain a bit more about accessibility and affordability within the context of this.
Brilliant, that's great. And this question might be one for Matt, because building out of that, we've got a question from Jason, which I suppose takes it away from the household to think about the community. And that is something that we've talked about in terms of the availability of support and infrastructure available. Matt, do you want to come in on that? Or if not, then Abby and Catherine.
I did the classic, I'm still muted then. You'd think we'd have learned about this. Yeah. Was that the question from Jason? Sorry. Yeah. About kind of infrastructure.
Yes.
And how what we're doing feeds into that. I think we did some work a few years ago looking at what places need, and in some ways the work we're doing now kind of builds on that, as well as building on the minimum income standard work that we do. So there are things that will be probably identified through the work that we're currently doing that relate to what people are able to access in terms of infrastructure, and we'll identify those things that are at a household level. So the things that households need in order to meet that digital living standard, but also the things that need to be provided within communities. I guess a lot of the conversation, and Sim says this a lot when he's talking about these things, that a lot of the conversation about digital inclusion gets reduced to wires in the ground. But those wires in the ground are fundamentally important in providing that minimum digital living standard, but it goes beyond that. So I think where the MDLS work kind of feeds into that is identifying what's a household need, and how those things can be met, but also feeding into discussions about what sorts of infrastructures new housing developments need, for instance. So how can we build that stuff in from the start in thinking about housing?
Yeah,
does that answer the question?
Yeah, brilliant. That's great, Matt. So I'm conscious of time, and I will, yes, Sim, I've just seen you waving, so I will come back to you in a second too. But just to explain what we're going to be doing, so we'll finish off the questions and answers discussion shortly, and then we'll have a short break, and we'll be inviting you back then. So do stay online, go and get a cup of tea, but stay online if you want to be allocated into a breakout room. If you need to go to another meeting, then we'll love you and leave you, and we will follow up. And if you didn't come in via the Eventbrite link, then Tom has posted the form for you to fill in. But I also wanted to say that I really love the question from Catherine Webb around implementation, and that is at the heart of what we want to be talking about in some of the breakout groups. How can this be used in terms of supporting policy change, practice change thinking? And how can we do that in an effective way? So Catherine, thank you so much for your question there. Another question has come through. I wondered, Sim, if this is the one you want to answer around what interest we've had from central government in this, and if not, I can speak to that.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. I was trying to pick up a couple of those questions and kind of wrap them together. So there was a question there from Gemma about relationship to essential digital skills, and there's the points that Matt made around beyond the household, community and infrastructure and so on. And then this also a question there about responsibility of who to deliver. I think the real power of this is if we think about where people get their digital skills from. And, Catherine talked about this, it could be that you're getting it from your relatives, you could be getting it from Good Things Foundation, you could be getting it from DWP, you could be getting it from education. So part of meeting the standard is, can you go somewhere to get the skills that make you confident and safe, etc. So that's about that community level rather than just household level. And I think the question now, maybe how it does link to the essential digital skills is, you know, if people need the skills to be confident, etc., and which of those essential digital skills do they need, that's where the two can kind of talk to each other. And on the responsibility thing, I'm going to do my favorite quote, which is, from a digital inclusion issues, is they're everybody's problem and nobody owns them. You know, it affects health, access to health, it affects access to education, it affects justice, it affects government, it affects talking to your friends, right? There are different stakeholders in this discussion about who provide different aspects of it, and the affordability and social tariffs from ISPs are all in that discussion. So I think what it does help is have that discussion about where those responsibilities lie for the different elements of meeting that overall standard. And in terms of engagement, I mean, obviously, you know, we've had the Welsh Government on today, and as Emma said, we're delighted that they've taken this forward and made it part of their policy. We're also engaged with people like Greater Manchester, who are looking at these things to make it part of their thinking and their digital inclusion type strategies. And we've got further discussions coming up, hopefully we've set up with DCMS and others. So part of, I think, what we want to do in that next session is talk about making this work, how it works, and what are those right conversations to have with stakeholders about how we drive this forwards once we've built it as something people can use to help them with whatever it is they're doing, whether it's engagement with citizens or it's designing infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. That is brilliant, Sim. And that's a really good link through. And just to echo that, Gemma, we definitely don't see this as replacing the absolutely critical and valuable roles that things like the UK Essential Digital Skills Report and Consumer Digital Index and Ofcom's work. I know Claire's on here as well. This isn't a replacement. That's partly also why Nominet have come on board as well, because they're really interested in how this can complement and inform and shape the discussions that they're having and their benchmarking around young people through the Nominet Digital Youth Index.
Yeah.
So it's really
I'm really excited about it. I think this is a really exciting piece of work, and it was a genuine question around how do we make sure that we can pull all of this brilliant stuff together and really go and use it as go and challenge people, because I think it's all the different constituent important parts, bringing it together and having being able to represent all of the different bits and challenge people in a really joined up way, I think is a really exciting opportunity. So no,
Fantastic.
Thank you for this morning. It's been really good.
Fantastic. That is great. So bring the ideas that you've got about how we can do that into this next session. We're going to have a 5-minute break now. If you're able to stay on and rejoin us in 5 minutes, let's make it 12:15, and we'll have allocated people to breakout rooms in between times. Thanks, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. See you in a bit. Bye.